September 18, 1953, at 2:43 p.m. in the sweltering heat of Memphis, Tennessee. A 1942 Lincoln Continental, more rust than metal, sat idling outside 706 Union Avenue. The engine rattled with a death knock that matched the heartbeat of the 18-year-old behind the wheel. Elvis Aaron Presley's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them steady on the steering wheel. The pomade in his hair, carefully applied that morning with $3.72 worth of product he couldn't really afford, was starting to melt in the 94-degree heat. Beads of sweat traced lines down his temples as he stared at the modest storefront of Memphis Recording Service, home to Sun Records. He'd been sitting there for 47 minutes watching people walk in and out of that door, professional musicians with instrument cases, men in suits who looked like they belonged. And here he was in his best shirt, the one with only one small tear near the collar that his mama had mended twice, clutching 4 crumpled dollar bills in his pocket. $4. That's what it cost to make a recording at Sun Records. $4 that represented 3 days of work at Crown Electric Company, where he drove trucks and tried not to think about music every waking moment. His throat was dry as sandpaper. The fear wasn't just nervousness. It was the bone-deep terror of wanting something so badly that your entire body rebels against the possibility of rejection. Every muscle fiber screamed at him to turn that rattling engine around and drive back to Lauderdale Courts, back to the 2-room apartment where dreams were luxuries the Presley family couldn't afford. But something else, something deeper than fear, kept his foot off the gas pedal. It was the same feeling he got when he sang in the shower at 4 in the morning before his shift, when his voice echoed off the tiles, and for just a moment, he wasn't a truck driver making $27 a week. He was something more. The door to Sun Records opened again. A man walked out carrying a guitar case, professional, accomplished, everything Elvis wasn't. The young man's jaw clenched so tight he could feel his molars grinding. This was insanity. He didn't even own a guitar. He'd borrowed one from his friend for this moment, and even that was sitting in the back seat like an accusation. But his mama's birthday was coming up. That's what he'd tell them. He just wanted to record a song for his mama's birthday. A lie, but a necessary one. Because how could he tell them the truth? How could he say that every single night since he was 11 years old, he'd fallen asleep imagining his voice on the radio? Marion Kasker was behind the desk when he finally walked in, his legs feeling like they were made of water. She looked up from her paperwork, took in the sight of this trembling kid with his slick-back hair and too tight collar, and something in her expression softened. She'd seen 100 young men walk through that door with the same look, desperate hope mixed with paralyzing fear. But there was something different about this one. Maybe it was the way he held himself, trying so hard to look confident while his hands shook like autumn leaves. Or maybe it was the unusual combination of vulnerability and determination in his eyes. "What can I do for you?" she asked. "I'd like to make a recording, ma'am, for my mother, for her birthday." The lie came out smoother than he expected. Marion nodded, professional but kind. "That's $4 for 2 songs. What were you thinking of singing?" Elvis pulled out the 4 bills, damp with sweat from being clutched so tightly. "My happiness, and that's when your heartaches begin." Marion led him back to the recording booth, a tiny space that smelled of cigarette smoke and old dreams. Sam Phillips, the owner, wasn't even there. He was out, probably working with real musicians, people who belonged in recording studios. Elvis was just another kid with $4 and a hope that somehow, someway, his voice might matter to someone besides his mama. "Whenever you're ready," Marion said through the glass. Elvis positioned himself at the microphone, the borrowed guitar foreign in his hands. His fingers found the strings, and for one terrifying moment his mind went completely blank. Every song he'd ever known vanished. His mouth was so dry he couldn't have spoken his own name. Then he thought of his mama, sitting in their tiny apartment, believing in him when nobody else had any reason to. He thought of all the nights she'd stayed up late, mending other people's clothes for extra money, never complaining, always telling him he was special, that God had given him a gift. The first note came out shaky, uncertain, but by the second line something shifted. The tiny booth disappeared, the fear dissolved. There was just the music and the strange, wonderful feeling of his voice being captured on tape, made permanent, made real. When he finished, Marion was staring at him through the glass with an expression he couldn't read. She made a note on a piece of paper. "Who do you sound like?" she asked. "I don't sound like nobody, ma'ams." The answer came out before he could stop it, and immediately he wanted to take it back. Who was he to claim he didn't sound like nobody? He was nobody, just a truck driver with $4 and a borrowed guitar. But Marion just nodded and wrote something else down. The session was over in 12 minutes, 12 minutes that had taken 18 years to arrive at. Elvis walked out with an acetate recording, the cheap disc that would probably wear out after a dozen plays, but he held it like it was made of gold. In the parking lot, he sat in that rattling Lincoln Continental and cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of having done it. He'd walked into Sun Records and he'd sung and nobody had laughed. Nobody had told him to leave. But that wasn't the end, it was barely the beginning. 3 months passed. Elvis played that acetate until it literally fell apart, memorizing every imperfection, every place where his voice had cracked or wavered. He saved another $4, then another. Each time he returned to Sun Records, Marion would greet him with that same kind smile, and each time Sam Phillips would be mysteriously absent. The message was clear without being stated. You're welcome to spend your money here, kid, but you're not what we're looking for. By January of 1954, Elvis had made 5 recordings at Sun Records, $20 he couldn't afford spent on a dream that seemed to be going nowhere. That's when he made the mistake of asking Marion directly, "Do you think Mr. Phillips would ever want to record me? I mean professionally." Marion's face changed. The kindness was still there, but it was mixed with something else, pity. "Honey, Sam's looking for something specific. You've got a nice voice, but," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Have you thought about sticking to truck driving? It's good, steady work. Not everyone's meant for the music business." The words hit like a physical blow. Elvis felt his face burning, not from anger but from humiliation. Truck driving, that's what he was good for, not music, truck driving. "The thing is," Marion continued, and her voice had taken on that tone people use when they're trying to let you down easy, "you don't really fit into any of the boxes. You're not country enough for country, you're not blues enough for blues, you're too different to be commercially viable. Sam needs artists who fit into categories that radio stations understand. You're talented, but talent isn't always enough. You need to be marketable." Too different, the words echoed in his head as he stumbled out of Sun Records. Too different to be commercially viable. He made it to his car before the full weight of the rejection hit him. His hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from the gut punch realization that maybe everyone had been right. Maybe his daddy had been right when he'd said music was a waste of time. Maybe his teachers had been right when they'd given him a C in music class and told him he couldn't carry a tune. Maybe the kids at Hums High had been right when they'd laughed at him for bringing his guitar to school. Elvis sat in that parking lot for nearly 2 hours, crying like he hadn't cried since he was a child. Not the relieved tears from months ago, but the bitter, crushing tears of dreams crumbling into dust. He was 19 years old, and he'd just been told by the only recording studio in Memphis that would even let him in the door that he wasn't good enough. That he would never be good enough. That he should stick to driving trucks for Crown Electric Company at $35 a week for the rest of his life. The acetate recordings he'd made seemed to mock him from the passenger seat. $20 worth of pathetic hope. $20 that could have gone to helping his parents pay rent or buying his mama a real birthday present instead of a cheap recording of her son's voice. What kind of fool spends grocery money on a dream that professionals say is worthless? The sun was setting by the time he finally started the car. The engine knocked and rattled, a perfect soundtrack to his failure. He drove slowly through the streets of Memphis, past Beale Street where the real musicians played, past the radio station that would never play his music, past all the places where he didn't belong and never would. By the time he pulled up to Lauderdale Courts, it was dark, and he could see his mama through the window, setting the table for dinner. She'd made cornbread, he could smell it from the parking lot. Cornbread and beans again, because that's what you ate when you were poor and your son wasted money on foolish dreams. He sat in the car for another 10 minutes trying to compose himself. His eyes were swollen from crying, and he knew his mama would notice. She always noticed. Finally, he walked up the concrete steps to their apartment, each step feeling like an admission of defeat. Gladys Presley took one look at her son's face and knew. She didn't ask what happened. She just opened her arms and Elvis collapsed into them like he was 8 years old again, not 19. They stood there in the doorway, her stroking his hair while he sobbed out the whole story, Marion's words, the rejection, the humiliation of being told he should stick to truck driving. When he finally finished, Gladys pulled back and looked him straight in the eye. Her own eyes were blazing with a fury Elvis had rarely seen. "You listen to me, Elvis Aaron Presley. That woman, that Marion, and that Sam Phillips, they don't know everything. You know what their problem is? They can't see past their own limitations. They say you don't fit in their boxes. Good. Boxes are for dead things. You're alive, son. You're so alive it scares people." "But Mama," she said, "I was too different." "Too different?" Gladys repeated and laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Elvis, baby, being different isn't your weakness. It's their weakness that they can't understand it. You think everyone who ever did something great fit into a neat little category. You think they all sounded like somebody else. No, baby. The ones who change things, the ones who matter, they're always too different at first. Always." She led him to the kitchen table, pushed a plate of cornbread and beans in front of him. "You know what strong people do, Elvis? They turn pain into power. Every single rejection, every single no, every single person who tells you you're not enough, you take that hurt and you forge it into something they can't ignore. You don't let it break you, you let it make you." Elvis stared at his mother, this woman who'd never graduated high school, who'd picked cotton since she was a child, who'd never been more than 100 miles from where she was born. But in that moment, she seemed to understand something fundamental about the world that all the experts and professionals had missed. But how, Mama? I can't even afford to keep making recordings. Gladys was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked to the coffee tin where she kept the household money. She pulled out a $10 bill, their food money for the next week, and placed it in front of Elvis. You go back, you keep going back, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. And Elvis, she touched his face gently. When you make it, and you will make it, you remember this feeling. You remember what it's like to be told you're not enough. Because someday, some other kid is going to walk into your world feeling the same way you feel right now, and you're going to be the one who says yes when everyone else says no. The next morning, Elvis woke up different. The sorrow from the previous day had crystallized into something else, not quite anger, but a barely controlled conviction. He went to work at Crown Electric, but his mind was elsewhere. During his lunch break, instead of eating, he practiced guitar in the back of his truck. After work, instead of going home, he drove to the library and read every book about music history he could find. He learned about artists who'd been rejected dozens of times before breaking through. He studied what made certain songs work. He wasn't just going to be different anymore, he was going to be undeniably different. 2 weeks later, he was back at Sun Records with his mother's $10. Marion looked surprised to see him. I'd like to make another recording, Elvis said, but his voice was different now, steadier, harder. Elvis, I thought we discussed. You discussed, I listened, now I'd like to make a recording. Something in his tone made Marion step back. She took his money and led him to the booth. This time Elvis didn't shake. This time his hands were steady on the guitar. This time when he opened his mouth to sing, it wasn't with the tentative hope of a boy asking for permission. It was with the controlled fire of someone who'd been to the bottom and decided that was just another place to push off from. He sang Blue Moon of Kentucky, but not the way Bill Monroe had written it. He sang it the way Elvis Presley heard it in his head, faster, with a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere between gospel and blues, country and something else entirely. He sang it too different to be commercially viable. He sang it exactly the way they'd told him not to. Marion's mouth was hanging open when he finished. She immediately made a phone call. 20 minutes later, Sam Phillips walked through the door. Elvis had never actually met the man who owned Sun Records, had only seen him from a distance. Sam was shorter than Elvis had expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Play it again, Sam said simply. Elvis played it again, then Sam made him play it a third time, then a fourth. Each time, Elvis pushed a little harder, let a little more of that difference, that unmarketable, uncommercial difference shine through. When he finally stopped, Sam Phillips was silent for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that changed everything. Where have you been hiding, boy? It turned out that Sam Phillips had been looking for exactly what Elvis was. He just hadn't known it until he heard it. For months, Sam had been searching for a white artist who could sing black music with authenticity, someone who could bridge the gap between the segregated radio stations, someone who could take the energy and soul of rhythm and blues and make it accessible to white teenagers who weren't allowed to listen to race records. He'd been looking for someone too different to fit into existing boxes, because he wanted to create a new box entirely. Marion told me I should stick to truck driving, Elvis said, and there was no accusation in it, just fact. Sam looked at Marion, who had the grace to blush. Marion's good at a lot of things, Sam said carefully, but recognizing revolution isn't one of them. No offense, Marion. None taken, Marion said quietly, but she was staring at Elvis like she was seeing him for the first time. Sam Phillips spent the next 3 hours with Elvis in that tiny booth, not just recording but exploring. He had Elvis sing everything: gospel songs from church, blues he'd heard on Beale Street, country songs from the radio, pop songs from the movies. With each song, Elvis let more of himself show through, that strange, indefinable quality that Marion had dismissed as uncommercial. You know what your problem is, Sam said finally. Your problem is that you're about 5 years ahead of where music is going, but that's not really a problem, that's an opportunity. We just have to help the world catch up to you. July 5, 1954. Less than a year after Marion Kasker had told him to stick to truck driving, Elvis Presley recorded That's All Right at Sun Records. Sam Phillips was there this time, not absent, not too busy with real musicians. He was there producing, pushing Elvis to be even more different, even less commercial, even harder to categorize. The session ran late into the night. They were taking a break, and Elvis started fooling around with an old blues song by Arthur Crudup. He sped it up, added a rhythmic hiccup to his voice, played it with a joy that transformed the song from a lament into a celebration. Sam's head snapped up from the control board. What are you doing? Just fooling around. Well, fool around some more, and this time we're recording it. They captured it in one take. One perfect, impossible, uncommercial take that sounded like nothing else on the radio because it was nothing else. It was Elvis Presley finally being exactly who Marion had said he couldn't be, too different to be commercially viable. 2 days later, DJ Dewey Phillips, no relation to Sam, played That's All Right on his Red Hot and Blue show on WHBQ. The station received 14 phone calls in the first 3 minutes. By the end of the night, they'd received over 40 requests for the song. Dewey had to play it 7 times in a row. Marion was working the desk at Sun Records when the calls started coming in from record stores wanting to know how to order this new Elvis Presley record. She answered each call professionally, took down the orders, and said nothing about the day she'd told him to stick to truck driving. But when Elvis came in that afternoon, she called him over. "I owe you an apology," she said simply. "No, ma'am, you don't." "Yes, I do. I was dead wrong about you. Not just a little wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. I was too limited to understand what you were doing. I could only see what already existed, not what could exist." Elvis looked at this woman who'd rejected him, who'd almost convinced him to give up, and he thought about what his mama had said about remembering this feeling. "You weren't wrong, Miss Marion. I didn't fit into any boxes. You were right about that. You were just wrong about that being a problem." By the end of 1954, Elvis had recorded 5 singles for Sun Records. Each one was too different, too hard to categorize, too uncommercial. Each one sold more copies than the last. Radio stations didn't know whether to play him on country shows or rhythm and blues shows, so they played him on both. Teenagers didn't care that he didn't fit into boxes, they cared that he made them feel something they'd never felt before. January 1955. Elvis was performing at the Louisiana Hayride, a radio show that had given him a chance when the Grand Ole Opry had rejected him for being too wild. In the audience was a talent scout from RCA Records sent to see this kid who was causing such confusion in the music industry. Nobody could figure out what Elvis Presley was, but everyone agreed he was something. The scout's report back to RCA was telling, "This Presley kid doesn't fit into any of our existing categories. He's not country, he's not pop, he's not rhythm and blues. He's all of them and none of them at the same time. He's unmarketable by any traditional standard." Then, the crucial addition, "We need to sign him immediately before someone else figures out that he's creating his own market." RCA bought Elvis's contract from Sun Records for $35,000, an unheard-of sum for an artist who'd been told he should stick to truck driving just 18 months earlier. Sam Phillips used that money to launch the careers of Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins. But he always said Elvis was the one who taught him the most important lesson of his career. The artists who change everything are always told they're too different at first. Elvis went on to sell over 500 million records worldwide. He became the best-selling solo artist in the history of recorded music. He changed not just music but culture itself, breaking down barriers between white and black music, between high and low art, between what was acceptable and what was possible. All because he was too different to be commercially viable. But here's what the history books don't always mention. Elvis never forgot that parking lot breakdown. He never forgot crying for 2 hours because someone with supposed expertise had told him he wasn't enough. Years later, when he had his own recording studio and young artists would come to him for advice, he would tell them about Marion Kasker and that day at Sun Records. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. "She did me a favor," he would say. "She showed me that rejection isn't failure. It's just someone else's inability to see what you see in yourself. If I'd fit into her boxes, if I'd been commercially viable by her standards, I would have been just another singer. But because I didn't fit, because I was too different, I had to become Elvis Presley." In 1960, Marion Kasker gave an interview to a music magazine. The reporter asked her about discovering Elvis Presley, because by then, history had been rewritten to make her a part of his success story. She corrected him. "I didn't discover Elvis. If anything, I almost destroyed him. I told him to stick to truck driving. I told him he was too different. Sam Phillips discovered Elvis, but more importantly, Elvis discovered himself. He discovered that being told you're not enough can be the beginning of proving that you're more than anyone imagined." This is the untold legacy of Elvis Presley. Not the fame, not the money, not even the music. It's the legacy of every person who's been rejected by an expert, dismissed by an authority, told they're too different, too strange, too much themselves to succeed. It's the legacy that says expertise is often just elaborate guesswork, that commercial viability is a moving target that moves toward the bold, and that the space between rejection and triumph is often just persistence mixed with the courage to remain yourself when everyone tells you to be someone else. Legends don't start as legends. They start as hopeful young people with dreams that seem too big for their circumstances. They start as 18-year-olds with $4 and borrowed guitars, sitting in parking lots trying to work up the courage to walk through a door. They start with rejection, with tears, with being told they should stick to driving trucks. But here's what separates the ones who become legends from the ones who don't. They take that rejection and they alchemize it. They turn the pain into power, the no into not yet, the you're too different into I'm exactly different enough. They understand that when someone tells you that you don't fit into existing boxes, they're accidentally telling you that you have the power to create new ones. Strong people turn pain into power. Elvis Presley turned the pain of being told he was unmarketable into becoming one of the most marketed faces in human history. He turned being too different into being irreplaceable. He turned stick-to-truck driving into a multi-billion-dollar industry that exists to this day. So here's the question for everyone listening. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? Have you ever been rejected by someone who was supposed to know better? Have you ever been informed that you're too different, too unusual, too much yourself to succeed? What did you do to prove them wrong? Or more importantly, what will you do? Because if a truck driver from Mississippi with $4 and a borrowed guitar could change the world by being too different, what's stopping you from doing the same?